This is the first of this year's series in the David Schroeder Music and Culture series, and it's always such a delight to have David and Linda here with us today, and all of you as well. So to begin in the right way, let's acknowledge that we are located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This is a territory that is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship that were first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of land or resources, but rather recognized Mi'kmaq and the Lost-Away title. The treaties established the rules for an ongoing relationship between nations, which allow people like me to live here as an uninvited guest. Let's also celebrate the African Nova Scotian communities who have been part of the fabric of this land for 400 years, and let's honor their culture and resilience when we acknowledge that we are all treaty people. My name is Jacqueline Warwick, and it's my privilege today to introduce Phillip Ewell. Phillip was recently a guest on the musicology podcast Sound Expertise, where he was introduced as the most controversial music scholar on the planet right now. So I might as well just quote it. Phil is a professor of music theory at Hunter College in New York. He earned a doctorate in music theory from Yale University, working under the supervision of Alan Fort, and has a specialism in Russian music, and particularly the work of Schroeder. He's also an accomplished cellist, and he has been in Halifax before, and in fact performed in this very building under the baton of Pierre Boulez back in 1991's Scotia Fest. So where's the controversy in that? Those are impeccable credentials. In his recent work, Phil has emerged as a leading figure in the work to decolonize music education. In his address at a keynote panel at the Society for Music Theory in 2019, in his blog posts, in interviews and guest lectures, and most recently in his book on music theory and making music more welcoming for everyone. He shows us how to go beyond just inserting underrepresented musicians and repertoires into our teaching. Rather, he guides us to consider the very framework of our curriculum and our pedagogical philosophies, and to question the tools and methods that we teach our students and tell them are essential tools. So I'll just quote from his book. He writes, "Perhaps more than anything, I'm interested in one concept, power, and how it is organized, maintained, and challenged in music theory. That is, I treat race as an analytical category within music theory, and I underscore historical aspects of the field to reveal how music theoretical power is achieved." Ewell's ideas are inspiring, they're provocative and challenging, and he is a committed public intellectual who has contributed to media stories for the New York Times, the BBC, Deep Sight, The Economist, and this morning, the CBC. I think that was your first CBC.
It was, indeed, yes.
To the list. We are so thrilled that he accepted our invitation and really delighted to have this time with him. So please join me in welcoming Phillip Ewell.
Thanks, Jacqueline, for that very warm welcome. I'm going to jump right in here. It is, of course, an honor to be here. I have a bibliography for today's talk on my website, and you can find it there. You don't need to write down any citations. Just to let you know, I've timed my talk at about 55 minutes, so it's a little longer, just so you know what you're in for. Much of it is, in fact, scripted. I found that when you're dealing with race scholarship, you have to be very precise. People will come after you if you are not. So much of my talk I'll be reading from script. I'd say 80% or so. A couple of times I'll come off. I have given this talk a few times, and I'll just say straight up that it's very U.S.-centric, right? You could imagine. I'm, of course, a U.S. citizen. And I've tried to make little caveats for my Canadian colleagues and friends, but I'm just going to come straight out and say that very often I stay with the United States of America, but of course there's plenty of overlap. You know, that Venn diagram would maybe be 80% overlap between your country and mine in terms of music and music education, right? So I think much of what I say has a lot of applicability here. So the title of my talk is Racialized Musical Histories. You can see I'm playing with the word histories. It is a history. Is it a history? Is it a story? I will highlight often in red, as you see here, that word as I make my way through. I had the good fortune of having dinner with Stephen and Jacqueline a couple of months ago when my family was here visiting my wife and son and I. And I can remember asking Stephen if y'all can sit with a little bit of discomfort today, you know, because it is a little difficult. And of course, Stephen was like, well, you're an intrepid bunch here, so I think you can handle it, right? Now, obviously, if there are any problems with today's talk or inaccuracies or, I don't know, infelicities, they fall squarely on the shoulders of Stephen Bauer, obviously, because with Phil Ewell, the buck stops way over there. with Dalhousie Professor of Musicology, Stephen Bauer. I joke about evading responsibility and blaming others, since we're currently living through a period in US history, and I imagine here in Canada as well, in which it seems shirking responsibility and blaming others is not only acceptable, but a badge of honor. Moreover, power structures often say that we race scholars want to blame white people for things, or that we want white people to feel guilty about our racial past. But this is nonsense. No self-respecting race scholar speaks in terms of blame or guilt. Rather, we speak in two terms: responsibility and accountability. And not just for white persons, but for everyone. Or as Kimberly Crenshaw said it, when it comes to racial reckoning, the future of our country, and yours, I would put to you, depends not on whether we litigate who among us is guilty, but whether we all see ourselves as responsible. So two things: responsibility, accountability for everyone, something I tried to teach my 13-year-old every day, though I hasten to add on that count, I am failing miserably. So there it is. So let's get this party started.
But it's just, you have to have these conversations, and it's just this weird thing, like, why is there no response to stories of racism? I'm talking about, like, I'm not talking about, like, on the right, because the right has the same response to you. If you tell somebody the right, you're a racist guy, and they go, hey, you know, that thing is racist. You know, okay, I'll walk on Twitter and we're done here, you know? I don't watch Fox News, like you're in jail, you know? But then there's a thing that happens with white people who are your friends, who are on the left, and that thing where you go, hey man, you know, it was racist. They go, how do you know it was racist? See everybody go, oh, people go, oh, no, yeah. Do you get that response sometimes? How do you know it was racist? It happened like this. How do you know it was racist? We're like, show set. How do you know it was racist? And because I'm kind of an expert in this, I've been studying it my whole life, whether I wanted to or not, I don't know. And let me just explain why. This is what it sounds like when you say that to us, because I don't think you get how crazy that sounds. It would be like if I was to run into you on the street correcting a white person. And I was like, hey, what do you do today? It's like, oh, I got up, I was errands, and I had lunch. What did you have for lunch? I had pizza. How do you know it was pizza? You're like, what are you talking about? You're like, you know it was pizza. It was when they said pizza. I had pizza almost every day. That's why I think suspicious. I have all this pizza every day. There's pizza everywhere in the world. Now, I don't smell the pizza you're saying. I don't think I had pizza. Are you sure it wasn't peanut butter with cheese on it? Are you sure it wasn't peanut butter with cheese on it? No, it was pizza. I've eaten a lot of pizza in my life. My parents ate a lot of pizza. My grandparents ate a lot of pizza. My great-great-great-grandparents were brought to this country to make pizza, but they weren't allowed to eat it weirdly. I know it's goddamn pizza.
How did you know it was pizza? And more to the point, how do you know if you are being pizzist? When whiteness tells the stories of our American racial past, it often gives skewed accounts and, in extreme instances, erases racial injustice from existence. Think here of the Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre from 1921, which whiteness effectively erased from U.S. history for nearly 100 years. Then, as is so often the case in the United States, these white stories get memorialized as history, an accurate retelling of events that can then be taught to and enshrined in the American mind. Yet when blackness tells its version of the story, blackness is often told by whiteness that that version is biased, emotional, and not rooted in fact. We blacks are told by whiteness that our history is divisive, that we are storytelling in a gather round the campfire, children kind of fashion. And most important, in our American racial fantasy, black perspectives must remain stories and never be considered histories, which would puncture the bubble of whiteness's greatness, whiteness's nobility. In the case of the Tulsa Race Massacre, in which white mobs slaughtered roughly 300 black residents while displacing and terrorizing thousands more, the white media told a white story by immediately recasting the event as a riot, which sought to reframe the violence as legitimate self-defense. Stories ran about colored and white people dying in a riot. The fact that 2 whites had died took precedence over the slaughter of 300 blacks, and in a quick subsequent court case, a grand jury blamed Negroes for inciting race rioting while clearly exonerating whites. And in a case of black history, Viola Fletcher, at age 107, one of only 3 survivors of the massacre, gave congressional testimony in May of 2021, finally giving voice to a national audience of her first-person testimony of the horrors of the massacre of black persons in Tulsa when she was a 7-year-old girl. In some languages, story and history are rendered by the same word, as in French, histoire, or Russian, istoria. That is, stories and histories are 2 sides of the same coin. I will let the listener decide for themselves whether I'm telling stories or writing histories today. But in either case, the racial aspect of U.S. history simply must become part of our narratives if we ever wish to confront our utter racial dystopia that we all now face. Today, I'll discuss some of music's white stories in hopes of coming to a more nuanced version of the academic study of music. Throughout my talk today, I, as a black person, will be conveying a black perspective on these stories, a perspective that I'll suggest to you is black history. Toward the end of my talk, I'll discuss why our music curricula remains so racially segregated even today and offer a few ideas for a path forward. The white story of Western civilization and origin myths. Many scholars have shown that the idea that ancient Greece was the sole progenitor of Western civilization was at best spurious and at worst harmful, creating confusion and obstacles to progress. Historians such as Nell Irving Painter, who writes, "Without a doubt, the sophisticated Egyptian, Phoenician, Minoan, and Persian societies deeply influenced the classical culture of ancient Greece, which some still imagine as the West's pure and unique source." Historian Kwame Anthony Appiah, who writes, Western civilization is at best the source of a great deal of confusion, at worst an obstacle to facing some of the great political challenges of our time. I believe Western civilization is not at all a good idea, and Western culture is no improvement. And classicist Rebecca Futo Kennedy, who writes that the concept of Western civ doesn't emerge until the late 19th century, and when it does, it is explicitly white supremacist. Notably, music's Western canon can also easily be tied to America's historic white supremacy. Perhaps the most significant historian to take on the origin myths of Western civilization was Martin Bernal in his 3-volume Black Athena, in which he forms 2 models for Greek history, namely what he calls the European or Aryan model on the one hand and the Levantine or ancient model on the other. Ultimately, he suggests that we should replace the newer European Aryan model with the ancient one which accepts the fact that Egypt colonized Greece long before Socrates came along, a history that the ancient Greeks themselves acknowledged. This, he urges, because the newer European Aryan model was based on racist thought and white supremacy. Of course, the concept of racial purity was an obsession of white supremacists, and the Aryan model of ancient Greece successfully promoted racial purity. Bernal shows that the creation of the European Aryan model of ancient Greece served as a perfect mythology to sustain and justify not just Western greatness, but its violent excursions across the globe and its rapacious lust for colonies outside of Europe. If Europe and its racial whiteness were to be put forth as superior, it would need a story to sell this superiority. And the European Aryan model of ancient Greece provided just that story. Unsurprisingly, Martin Bernal's landmark Black Athena caused immediate controversy. Perhaps the most ardent defender of the divine provenance of the ancient Greeks was classicist Mary Lefkowitz, who wrote a monograph, Not Out of Africa, How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History. I find it telling that Lefkowitz adds teaching myth as history in the subtitle of her monograph, since teaching the ancient Greeks is so often exactly that. Think here of the almost certainly false story of Pythagoras at the blacksmith's shop, in which he divined through hammers of proportionate weight the intervals of the octave, fifth, and fourth. We in music have created an entire mythology of Pythagoras and those hammers at the shop, and somehow it seems perfectly fine to treat this story as somehow authoritative, if not factual, and not mythological, which it almost certainly was. In other words, the white story of Pythagoras at the blacksmith shop has become history. This brings up the largest problem with Mary Lefkowitz's counterarguments. In a 2018 piece, Black Athena, White Power, Are We Paying the Price for Classics' Response to Bernal? Classicist Denise Eileen McCoskey puts it better than I can. Leaving aside the personalities and general climate surrounding Black Athena, it is Lefkowitz's main premise regarding historical inquiry that I want to call out, since it is one too many classicists still endorse today, namely, that Afrocentrism pursued readings of the ancient world based in emotion, biased, and the need to build self-esteem, while classics, tightly wrapped in the mantle of objectivity, rigorously sought the truth. This spot-on criticism of Lefkowitz resonates deeply with me, since so many in conservative quarters of music theory, the vast majority of whom are in fact white men, have criticized my own Afrocentric work combining race scholarship with music theory as emotional and biased, while their own arguments are to be considered reasoned and objective. But this is one of the most effective tactics in the promotion of our white male frame, namely, painting the person questioning why the racialized and gendered structures of what we do exist as an emotional and unhinged critic. For my own race scholarship in music, I myself have been called a charlatan, moron, dumbass, anti-Semite, and nitwit, among many other slurs on social media and in unsolicited communications, while those who defend the status quo are heroes of the natural order of things and of the truth. McCoskey continues, such a dichotomy that emotional people of color politicize history while reasonable white people seek objective fact was patently false in the 1980s, even as it became a staple in the arsenal of arguments defending the exclusionary practices of many disciplines. Needless to say, the notion that white people are somehow more conditioned for objectivity when it comes to historical thought is painfully false when set against the backdrop of white supremacy's renewed nostalgia for the classical world. Painfully false indeed. Is it any wonder that even today there are still those in music theory who would believe that white men are somehow more inclined toward a dubious objectivity, while others toward a fraught emotionality? The white story of the Western canon in music. To see how Western mythology is played out in music, I'll turn to the most famous historical textbook, A History of Western Music by Donald Grout. I'll cite the 4th and 10th editions from 1988 and 2019, respectively. The 4th, which added the Yale University music theorist Claude Poliska, was very much like the previous 3 editions. Right off the bat, Grout and Poliska begin with the Roman Empire in the 5th century, highlighting the Christian era. The history of Western art music properly begins with the music of the Christian church. But all through the Middle Ages, and even to the present time, artists and intellectuals have continually turned back to Greece and Rome for instruction, for correction, and for inspiration in their several fields of work. This has been true in music. With these words and this textbook, the origin myths of ancient Greece in music were solidified. Grout and Poliska explicitly tie Western art music to the Christian church, a church that obviously didn't exist in ancient Greece. Here, the authors are splitting the difference. Western music began with the Christian church, but it also didn't, because it began with ancient Greece. Of course, there were many musical traditions that predated those of the Christian church, or ancient Greece for that matter, but they have been erased from Western history. But Grout and Poliska were not at all exceptional in this erasure. It was, in fact, the story of mid-20th century America in all such historical accounts of music. Cutting to the 2019 10th edition, which added Indiana University musicologist Peter Burkholder, many changes are notable. There are more compositions from women and BIPOC, generally, and different genres, such as jazz and popular musics. Still, the outlines from Grout's original text are ever present in this newest edition, and the pitfalls still the same. I'm made uncomfortable by many parts of the long quotation on the slide. The notion of pitting the West against Asia as some kind of antipode to the total erasure of Africa and the pre-colonial Americas. The problematic belief that our philosophy is founded on Plato and Aristotle, or that our literature came only from Greek and Latin traditions, or that the West does not include Islam, which has been part of Europe since that religion's founding in the 7th century Common Era, to say nothing of other European non-Abrahamic religions. But most troubling to me is the incessant use of the first-person plural pronouns, our and we. I myself was born in Long Beach, California, to an African-American dad and a Norwegian mom, and I've lived for 4 years in Canada, that's right, when I was 1 to 5 years old, Winnipeg and Toronto, 7 years in Russia, and the rest of my life in the United States. I could therefore reasonably be called a Westerner. I'm speaking in English, after all. Yet I see very little of myself in this long quotation. What about those tens of millions of US and Canadian citizens and permanent residents whose connections to any alleged West are more distant than mine? And what about those millions of US and Canadian citizens who were here long before Europeans began arriving, roughly 500 years ago? Dalhousie is located in Mi'kma'ki, as Jacqueline said, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And throughout the horrors of colonialization, these indigenous peoples remained here in Nova Scotia and elsewhere. They are still here, and they should be honored. I strongly doubt that they would see the our and the we in the long quotation on this slide. In hindsight, the quotation could have been set up with a simple clause. As whiteness and maleness have taught us over roughly, but not more than, 150 years, the culture of Europe and the Americas, etc. All of which is to say that the history of Western music is based on a lie. And that lie of a Western civilization going back to the ancient Greeks, but not a day further, is, for all intents and purposes, deeply rooted in white supremacy. Other academic fields have done a far better job than we have in academic music in interrogating their histories from a racial perspective. In American music theory and history, discussions about race have systematically been ignored or obscured, and it's high time we begin those discussions. For all its outstanding scholarship, what this newest version of A History of Western Music does, as most such works do, is adapt Western mythologies to new 21st century realities on the ground. What this means is to engage in additive activities, which fall under the rubric of diversity, equity, and inclusivity, or DEI, and I think you say EDI here. Additive activities, Canadian ethnomusicologist Dylan Robinson calls this additive inclusion. Adding women and BIPOC figures, for instance, other non-classical genres of American music, and still other global musics that become known as non-Western or world music, all while acknowledging the changing nature of the field. For example, at the end of the 10th edition, in a section entitled The Future of Western Music, Burkholder writes, "The popularity of fusions, mashups, mixtures, and blends in recent years is only the latest manifestation of a long-standing trait in the Western tradition, combining multiple influences to create something new." True, Western music, such as it is, adapts, or I might add, conquers. But what it does not do, what it can never do, is reveal the truth about itself, namely, that there is no such thing as the West, and there never has been. Now, I imagine that many of you here know something of the brouhaha about the Journal of Schenkerian Studies, Volume 12, that took place in 2020. I'll take a sip of this here. But If you don't, I'm going to give a little 60-second recap because I'd like to make a point after that. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I figured I would give myself 60 seconds and you'll get a general idea of what happened. So wish me luck. On November 9th, 2019, I gave a 20-minute plenary talk, Music Theory's White Racial Frame, at the annual meeting of the Society for Music Theory. I used language from sociologist Joe Fagan to point to the racism and injustice of our field. Since I pointed out the racism of the music theorist Heinrich Schenker and linked it to racial injustice, the Journal of Schenkerian Studies decided to hurriedly publish a response symposium to my talk. Strangely, I was not invited to participate in any fashion, and the 15 published responses were not peer-reviewed. Several of the responses contained anti-black language. David Beach said that I should stop complaining about white guys, while Timothy Jackson wrote that blacks need to be raised up to standard in order to compete. Another response author, Alan Cadwallader, sent me a personal email calling me an inept idiot. In other words, volume 12 was Pizzist. Many came to my defense and condemned volume 12, including SMT, Yale University, University of Toronto, and the graduate students at UNT where volume 12 was published. An open letter was signed by more than 900 people and was addressed to SMT urging anti-racist action. Then the media jumped in. Stories ran at Fox News, The New Yorker, The New York Times, Russian National TV, und die Zeit, was natürlich super war. Dankeschön. Ooh. The kablooey didn't quite sound. There's a little delay there. It's supposed to be. Now I will briefly discuss, as promised, one reaction to the JSS affair that demonstrates some of the white stories that get put forth as histories when racism happens. This reaction, this European white story, came in the form of a European open letter, which proves that the racism that was contained in volume 12, and therefore in American music theory, is not limited to the United States. One thing that I've emphasized overall with my race scholarship in music is that white supremacy was and is very much a worldwide project, and that it originated in Europe, not the United States. USA, USA. Happily, this letter was signed by only 47 people, not like 900 who signed the anti-racist letter. And they wrote, for example, "We were unable to identify any anti-black statement nor any attack against Phillip Ewell, the man, which is the meaning of ad hominem, in this JSS volume." Setting aside the remarkable condescension of explaining what ad hominem means, their inability to see any racism or anti-blackness in the journal issue speaks to a common white perspective on, or white story about, racism. Exactly the same white perspective that comedian W. Kamau Bell talked about in his stand-up routine at the beginning of my talk today. Though they saw no attack against me in volume 12, the Europeans characterized my SMT plenary as an attack against Heinrich Schenker, which is another common white perspective if non-whiteness points out structural racism. To be clear, my talk was not an attack, but a challenge to music theory to think about race and confront racism in the field. The European authors characterized the entire affair as a dispute between me and Timothy Jackson. He's a music theorist at University of North Texas. To state the obvious, there has never been a dispute or debate between me and Timothy Jackson. Calling my talk an attack and then framing the ensuing issues as debate is an obfuscating tactic in white racial framing. In this case, to turn the anti-black racism of volume 12 into a legitimate form of self-defense. Or as Kimberly Crenshaw puts it, the hysteria about this putatively un-American inquiry, in this case it would be my inquiry into race and music theory, is possible in part because Americans are not often taught about the policies and practices through which racism has shaped our nation. Nor do we typically teach that racist aggression against reform has been repeatedly legitimized as self-defense, an embodiment of an enduring claim that anti-racism is racism against white people. The essence of volume 12 of the Journal of Schenkerian Studies was racist aggression against reform that was, in the European Open Letter, the New York Times, and countless other conservative media outlets, repeatedly legitimized as self-defense. Once we accept that simple truth and allow it to sink in, the reimagining, restructuring, the healing can begin. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a recent hit piece on me, Is Musicology Racist? By linguist, Columbia University. This is from May of this year in the New York Times, John McWhorter. And this was simply a hit piece on me and my book that Jacqueline showed you at the beginning of today. And he's a conservative black person, essentially. I'm going to make a few points here, and one is that anti-black black people are extremely useful to white supremacy. Think here of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas in the United States. You probably know that name. As I told the musicology students earlier today, whenever I say that name, I feel like I'm just swearing at you. I'm cussing up here, Clarence Thomas. Hey, keep it clean up there, Phil. He just dropped the CJ bomb. Very, very useful. And of course, maybe parenthetically, but the same point is true here. Anti-woman women are extremely useful to patriarchy. I could just say Amy Coney Barrett. She's also a Supreme Court justice. And of course, they would vehemently deny any anti-womanness or anti-blackness. And there it is. I mean, you could just look how they vote, okay? And you'll see exactly how anti-woman Amy Coney Barrett is and anti-black Clarence Thomas is. And John McWhorter, you can see him down here as a black person. And he's a conservative. He's a member of the Manhattan Institute. There's a connection. And a connection between him and Timothy Jackson, actually. They've tried to get together to pile up on me. But the final couple of points here about that is don't engage with the context of this kind of bad faith nonsense. This is my advice. In other words, don't take part in your own dehumanization. One thing that I was very successful with, I think, was being steadfast in just, nope, I'm not going to talk with you because you're not coming to me in good faith, right? I'm not going to pull some quotes from this article and engage with it because he probably read 5, maybe 10 pages of my book, maximum. He didn't read the book, right? It's very clear. And finally, I think it's very useful to thank people like John McWhorter who offered this nonsense for help in making your arguments. That's something I think I've been also pretty successful with. I say thank you because not only are they helping me make my arguments because it's so nonsensical what they write. If you read this, it's in my bibliography. You're welcome to do that. It's also making me a lot of money, actually, because I can say that my book flew off the shelves after this came out. I know, because I wanted to order some to hand out to friends and stuff, and I get a 40, 50% discount. And the guy was like, well, yeah, we'll do it, but there are none left. We have to print more, because McWhorter's piece came out, and that's it. We sold, I don't know, a couple, 3,000, right, like right away. That's not common for an academic press book, so thank you to John McWhorter for that. And another way I know that this works is because they go silent. They know. They leave me alone after a while. They're like, my God, not only is he not taking the bait, this Phillip Ewell seems to be enjoying it. And the answer to that is, I am. I'll be honest. I am. So I'm giving you a little bit of advice here. It might not be so mainstream as the New York Times, but I presume that many of you stand for social justice, and there are a lot of bad faith actors out there, so you have to kind of be aware of that. Okay, moving on. Desegregating the music curriculum. Why jazz is not part of the typical music theory curriculum? I'm sure that's the case here in Canada too. It certainly is in the United States. On its face, jazz represents the perfect genre for music theory. It has all the traits, melody, harmony, linear progressions, rich scales and modes, intricate rhythms, complicated chord progressions, and formal complexity commonly associated with the field. Jazz spans the tonal and atonal idioms and has a time-honored and well-developed theoretical tradition stretching back to the early 20th century. Jazz's worldwide impact is not in dispute, and many consider jazz to be, historically, America's most important music. Yet for all intents and purposes, jazz remains at the fringe of American music theory, most prominently in our undergraduate music theory core curriculum. Sure, there are jazz programs at most US and Canadian music institutions now, but they are still quite outside the generic undergraduate music major, an add-on to what is considered the essential knowledge of academic music, the quote-unquote supreme geniuses of a so-called Western canon. The best way to show why jazz is not part of basic music curricula is through an analysis, this time to US healthcare. In her piece for Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 project, New York Times staff writer Janine Interlandi unpacks the history of US healthcare from a racial perspective. She speaks of how, in the late 1940s, President Harry Truman made a hard push for a national universal single-payer healthcare system in the United States. Probably don't know that up here in Canada. Which initially had widespread public support and congressional support as well. The reason it ultimately failed was that the American Medical Association, which was an all-white male organization at the time, lobbied hard against it, claiming that government should stay out of healthcare. Interlandi speaks of how the AMA characterized national healthcare as socialized medicine, told of how it would destroy the doctor-patient relationship, and called Harry Truman a communist. Side note, in the late 1920s, Harry Truman, president after World War II, the United States president, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Not exactly a communist organization, I should say. The AMA supported racially segregated hospitals in which there were white floors and black floors. The black floors usually being in the basements. And they were able to keep hospitals racially segregated by torpedoing Truman's national healthcare system. All the same arguments played out in the battle for Medicare in the 1960s. Medicare is a little known fact that we actually have a national healthcare system. It's called Medicare. You just have to make it to age 65 to get it. It's very strange, but if you're 65, you have single-payer healthcare in the United States. I know my parents had that. It works quite well, actually. Just so you know what Medicare is. All of the same arguments played out in the battle for Medicare in the 1960s, but a significant black doctor, Montague Cobb, successfully counter-lobbied the AMA, and US President Lyndon Johnson signed Medicare into law in 1965. One would have thought that, when the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, American hospitals would have racially desegregated, since that was a key component of the Civil Rights Act, and that there would no longer be white floors and black floors, but that didn't happen. Medicare changed that in 1965, since millions and millions of federal dollars were available to hospitals that desegregated. The speed with which hospitals desegregated after Medicare passed was astonishing. Interlandi says, and so Medicare passes, and what happens is within 4 months of implementation, nearly 3,000 hospitals desegregate. And now for my analogy to jazz. From its beginnings, jazz has been deeply associated with African Americanism, and as such has been segregated out of music studies. In fact, this is the reason why all non-white musics have been segregated out of American music studies, but I digress. The reason why jazz was never integrated, the reason why American music studies, and especially American music theory, never truly desegregated to become more than just white and just male, is simple. We in academic study of music never had millions of federal dollars dangled in front of us saying, if you desegregate your music curriculum, you can have this money, but if you don't, you can't. It is a virtual impossibility that the racial views of the white male musicological doctors who created US music institutions were significantly different from the racial views of the white male medical doctors who created US healthcare institutions. In music, we've never had a moment of racial reckoning, a moment whereby we were forced to face our segregationist past, such as US hospitals faced in the 1960s. Sure, everyone knows that racial disparities in healthcare are still rampant in the United States today, but we also know that there are no longer any black floors or white floors in our hospitals. Sadly, American music theory and music studies still reside entirely, for all intents and purposes, on the white floors of our music institutions, while jazz and all other non-white musics are relegated to non-white floors. Our American music curricula are still racially segregated. Now, when I gave this talk in the States, I had a slide here saying I prefer to say desegregated over decolonial. Don't decolonize, but desegregate, because it's more specific. But here in Canada, it's a little bit different because you don't quite have the same legacy of slavery that we do. It is probably more appropriate to talk about decolonization in a Canadian context. But one thing I thought I would offer to you is what I say, because there are land acknowledgments here, which is great. You can see how I wove my land acknowledgement into the body of the text, which I think is even better. They're good, but it's nice if you can make it part of the scholarship. I'm going to offer a possible conference pop music origins acknowledgement, because pop music is so common now in our music theory, musicological circles. Historically in music theory, there's no mention of any race or any human aspect. It's dehumanized completely. It's stripped of its humanity. And here's just something I came up with, which I think would be nice for a pop music scholar to say before they actually present material at a conference. They could say, I acknowledge that the music I'll be examining today is deeply rooted in and indebted to blackness and African Americanism. I understand that African peoples created this music and this genre through their toil and tribulations, almost always without reaping the monetary or other benefits normally afforded to white artists who did and do the same. I pledge to work at rectifying this musical injustice through my academic work and other work, and I dedicate today's presentation to those Black and African American musicians without whose artistic efforts I would not be appearing before you today. So, food for thought. If you want to get that text, you just send me an email and I will shoot it right off. No copyright. You can just have it. Many jazz artists contributed to concert music, interacted with European methods, and produced music theoretical works, artists such as Muhal Richard Abrams, Jerry Allen, Anthony Braxton, Stanley Jordan, Yusuf Lateef, Wadada Leo Smith, Roland Wiggins, Mary Lou Williams, and Ollie Wilson. It would make perfect sense to feature such artists in our undergraduate music theory classes, and music classes, of course, and to teach their music theories as part of our own tonal and atonal traditions. George Russell's Lydian chromatic concept of tonal organization is one of the most significant theories of tonal harmony to ever be published in the United States and is ripe for exploration in its own right, within and not outside of American music theory. At once a practical manual, theoretical treatise on tonality, exercise book, historical narrative, discography, and improvisation workbook, the Lydian chromatic concept represents a fascinating account of mid-20th century practices in jazz and in tonality. Russell's historical perspective outlines the history of the modes and touches on such figures as Hucbald, Heinrich Glerion, Giuseppe Zarlino, Palestrino, and Claudio Monteverdi. Russell discusses Pythagorean tuning and other tuning systems to contextualize the equal temperament of his concept. In the final edition of his Lydian chromatic concept from 2001, Russell includes examples from J.S. Bach, Claude Debussy, and Maurice Ravel to show the applicability of his theory to tonality, to classical music. With respect to engaging with Russell's Lydian chromatic concept, let me be clear. I'm not suggesting that by citing European authors and composers, Russell's book is somehow legitimized and therefore worthy now of consideration. His book does not need legitimization. The only reason it has been widely discounted by American music theory is because Russell was black. A mixed-race black, in fact, with a white father and a black mother. Rather, I'm suggesting that this work could easily be integrated into our music theory curriculum at all levels, since Russell gives compelling American insights into tonal music. I think that the current integration of our music theory curricula, I think I have a napkin here. I think that the current integration of our music theory curricula from a class in music theory fundamentals to doctoral comprehensive exams with other non-white music theories is one of the most necessary and exhilarating moments in American music theory's history. Knowing of the exclusionary nature of the racialized structures of music theory and how unjust those structures are, we must all come together to dismantle them and forge new paths for the future. I'm always struck how by we in the States can think of European music as intimately ours, but our own American music as foreign. A violinist in East Tennessee can learn all the intricacies of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto, written over 150 years ago, some 5,000 miles away, but never dare play that same violin in an Appalachian fiddling style, which happens right now in their own backyard. Our promotion of music theory's European, quote-unquote, supreme geniuses at the expense of so many American genres, and not just jazz and bluegrass, of course, has greatly impoverished our American music institutions. We can enrich them all by understanding not only that many American and other global musics deserve our attention, but also that the European, quote-unquote, masters were actually just composers like all others. Composers who wrote interesting music, also deserving of attention, but not inherently better than other musics of our planet. This point is ultimately much larger than music theory. The missions of our music schools, departments, and conservatories were conceived decades ago, if not more than a century ago. And the hierarchical legacy of privileging European music over our own is still very much alive and well in the United States. This is something we must all confront as we forge new paths in the 21st century. Desegregating our music curricula does, to one extent, entail finding the music that was shunted to the side by our white male structures, and most American music institutions are engaging in this additive activity, which falls, as I said, under the rubric of diversity, equity, and inclusivity. Find a piece by Florence Price, research and rehearse it, put it onto a program, and repeat that cycle. The harder part of desegregation is the anti-racist work that can explain why a composer like Price was never considered worthy of attention in the first place. So on this slide, I have a few examples of where I'm comparing DEI work or EDI work here in Canada versus anti-racist, anti-sexist work, right? And I'll just go across as these and make these points. So a DEI initiative might be staging Shirley Graham Du Bois's opera Tom Tom, an epic of music and the Negro. She was the second wife of W.E.B. Du Bois. She, his second wife. He, her second husband. And she has an opera, a very interesting figure. The anti-racist version of the same, writing an academic work explaining why Tom Tom has been ignored because of structural racism and sexism. 2, the DEI action is forming a committee to discuss various aspects of race and gender in a music curriculum. That's kind of just the default action for DEI, right? The anti-racist version, voting in committee to discontinue a racist, sexist, exclusionist structure, like a graduate German language requirement. 3, allowing a student to pass a musicianship proficiency by substituting, say, the oud for the piano as an exception to a piano proficiency requirement. Anti-racist version, discontinuing the piano proficiency requirement altogether, having realized that it itself is a method of policing and enforcing a commitment to whiteness and maleness. 4, adding a Jewish or a Kwanzaa song to your winter holiday concert. The anti-racist version, examining the legacy of Christianity associated with such concerts and the potentially exclusionary aspects of a hidden Christianity requirement therein. And finally, a DEI initiative might be admitting a woman, a transgender man or woman, or a gender nonconforming person into your doctoral orchestral conducting program. The anti-racist version, committing in writing to have minimum 50% such persons within a given time frame, say 5 years, in your doctoral orchestral conducting program at all levels, from incoming students to senior faculty. Note, this is good, but it's sometimes not. Staging Shirley Graham Du Bois's opera, that's good. Committee formation is a smokescreen. I often say that DEI activities are the oxygen that white male structures need to maintain power and justify their existence in the 21st century. So beware when you're looking at this column over here. It might very well just be a big, huge smokescreen. Obviously, this is better, but beware even more. because this is when the knives come out. Believe me, I know. This is when the knives come out. I often say to my colleagues, my faculty colleagues, that you actually only need two things to do this kind of work over here. You're going to need tenure, and then you're going to need a really good high-speed internet connection, which, by the way, where I live in Brooklyn, is harder to get than tenure. So obviously what I'm doing is I'm giving a challenge to my tenured colleagues over here, which is you have power, use it. Right? Don't sit on the sidelines. There are people who need our support, who need our help, marginalized groups. My goodness, if you're a transgender person of color, goodness gracious, get off the sideline and offer that person the help and support that they need, right? Because there are people out there who are suffering, and I see too often that we are cowed into silence, and that we are afraid of doing things, we tenured faculty. And I'm getting animated up here when I think about it, because we need to use that power, and we need to stop being scared of the big bad people who have all the power, and then the people who play all the Beethoven piano sonatas, and the violinists who, you know, play the 5 Mozart concertos and everything. Fine, they can keep doing that. I don't have a problem. I have a problem when people think that they are entitled to power and privilege because they play the 5 concertos and because they play 32 sonatas by Beethoven. That's nonsense, and it should be challenged in the departments across both of our countries. Okay, so I am getting to the end here, I think. Oh, final point here. You can see that this is forcing the issue more than this is, right? This is more confrontational. I acknowledge that. I just love pointing out white men who agree with me on that, and there have been just countless numbers, right? And this is a great example from a great American, a German-American theologian. His name was Reinhold Niebuhr, a friend of Martin Luther King, who wrote in an epic landmark book called Moral Man and Immoral Society, he wrote, "However large the number of individual white men who do and who will identify themselves completely with the Negro cause, the white race in America will not admit the Negro to equal rights if it is not forced to do so. Upon that point, one may speak with a dogmatism which all history justifies." Bravo, right? Bravo. That's exactly right. Okay. My final black historical point for today concerns the Peabody Institute of Music in Baltimore, Maryland, one of the finest in the United States. In A Message of Inclusion, A History of Exclusion, Racial Injustice at the Peabody Institute, a 2019 master's thesis for Peabody, violinist Sarah Thomas tells the history of racial exclusionism at Peabody from a black perspective, a final black history for today. It took Peabody nearly a century after its founding in 1857 to admit its first black student, Paul Brent, a pianist, in 1949. And there was great controversy surrounding his admittance. Though racial exclusion was rarely written into school charters, it was generally accepted in segregated American educational institutions. Responding to Brent's application to Peabody, its president, William Marbury, wrote to the board of directors in July 1949, quote, "We are brought face to face with the issue whether to modify our longstanding rule against the admission of Negro students," unquote. Thus putting in writing that which was only unofficial policy at the time. Once the issue was put to a vote, only one board member, Douglas Gordon, openly opposed admitting Brent. This was just 5 years before Brown v. Board of Education in the United States. That was 1954, that officially ended constitutional racial segregationism, which had officially started in 1896 with Plessy v. Ferguson. That's the history of racial segregationism from a Supreme Court constitutional point of view. In Douglas Gordon's letter to President Marbury about admitting Paul Brent, Douglas Gordon wrote, "It seems to me that it would be a great mistake to change the present policy. In our climate, the presence of Negroes can to some be extremely offensive. Notwithstanding this, to others, their presence together with whites at school, etc., is, as in the South, going to lead to such a mixed race as one can see in Sicily or Brazil, not a very edifying spectacle." This was illegible because Sarah Thomas was transcribing from a handwritten note, right? The presence of Negroes can, to some, be extremely offensive. This is surely an abhorrent view, and today one might like to think that such views were, in fact, exceptional among whites in the early to mid-20th century. Unfortunately, this is simply not true. For example, about the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, Linda Gordon writes, "Most important, the 1920s Klan program was embraced by millions who were not members, possibly even a majority of Americans. Far from appearing disreputable or extreme in its ideology, the 1920s Klan seemed ordinary and respectable to its contemporaries." No. Such abhorrent views about blacks among whites in the early to mid-20th century were not at all exceptional. More likely, they were, in fact, the norm. And since I pointed out a presidential connection to the Ku Klux Klan and Harry Truman's dalliance as a member of the Ku Klux Klan, I would be remiss if I didn't point out another one. Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump, was on Memorial Day 1927 arrested in full KKK regalia in Queens, New York City. I could bike there from my apartment in Brooklyn in 1 hour. So there's another connection to the KKK, Fred Trump, before Donald Trump was born, of course, worth pointing out, but that was his father.
Wasn't Truman the person who integrated the armed forces?
He desegregated the military in 1948, that's correct. So let's give Harry Truman a little bit of credit that he, 20 years on from his KKK dalliance, he began to do different things. Nothing could be said about Fred Trump like that. Fred Trump was very much committed to whiteness, let's say, until the day he died. So I am getting toward the end here. Where am I? On the point of admitting Paul Brent to Peabody, there was otherwise great hesitancy among the other board members, as evidenced by another response to President Marbury, this one by board member J. Hall Pleasance, who wrote, "I vote reluctantly to admit Brent as a student," adding, "I feel that there is an hysterical element in the way the Negro question, especially in its racial aspects." Well, what other aspects are we talking about? "Things are going too fast." Slowing down racial progress is a common trope among white persons in the history of the United States, a slowing down often referred to as incrementalism or gradualism. Finally, the board members expressed that they could only admit Brent as an exception to their unwritten rule against admitting black students, rather than openly getting rid of racial barriers, and that he would only be so admitted if he were deemed, quote, "extremely talented," close quote, at his audition, which meant that a higher bar for admittance was being established for Brent as a black applicant. We blacks often say that we have to be twice as good as our white counterparts in order to get half the credit. I feel that often white persons either reject this view outright or have trouble understanding it. Well, with the case of Paul Brent, we have proof that he was being held to a higher standard than the typical white applicant at Peabody. They only accepted whites at this point. Sadly, being held to a higher standard still applies today to many BIPOC, women, or other minoritized groups in any number of arenas in the United States and here in Canada as well. A final point about this telling story, this black history. I imagine that when I said that Sarah Thomas told this story from a black perspective, that you might have thought that Sarah Thomas is in fact black. But she's not. Sarah Thomas is white. And like so many white race scholars before her, Sarah is doing true anti-racist work, precisely the type of work needed in order to truly desegregate our music curricula. Indeed, some of my favorite race scholars have been white, like Kathleen Belew on the paramilitary aspects of white supremacy, Ari Berman on voting rights, Jane Daly on the sexual panic surrounding white supremacy, Jonathan Metzl on dying of whiteness, Jesse Daniels on cyber racism, or Joe Fagan on white racial framing. And I should say here that I had the honor of being Jesse's mentee about 4 or 5 years ago as I worked on this project. She's a sociologist, Hunter College, she's queer, and she herself had studied with Joe Fagan at the University of Texas, Austin, a few decades ago, actually. And she was the one who said, hey, you really should read his book on white racial framing. And that's how that connection was made. I am now a dear online friend of Joe Fagan. In fact, we are co-editing an a volume called American Anti-Blackness now, which is a true honor for me, obviously, because he's an icon. Let's see. Finally, I think I've said that a few times already. This is like for realsy. Finally, I have called out whiteness and maleness as structures today, which they have historically and undoubtedly been in the United States and Canada. But I really must separate white male persons from those structures. Some of the very best allies I've ever had in my career have been, in fact, white men. And as I've delved deeper and deeper into race scholarship, I've been honored and humbled at the countless white men who have contacted me to have deep discussions about American music's racial past and how we can move forward together in a positive fashion. And on a personal note, as a mixed-raced black guy myself, I can say with certainty that my Norwegian mother was a far better anti-racist than my black African-American father, and it was, in fact, my white mom who taught me the true meaning of anti-racism long before that term entered my vocabulary. Choking up here. If I could give you all one parting piece of advice, it would be to make race scholarship part of your next musical project. Whether it's researching non-white composers who were neglected for all the wrong reasons, examining your own racial positionality, or digging into the archives to show how white supremacist musical structures have harmed everyone in our American music academies. This work is arduous and exhausting, but rewarding and emancipating. So that is my official advice to you all. And as you trek this difficult path, if things do go sideways for you, my unofficial advice is that you take a page out of my playbook and just blame Dalhousie Professor of Musicology, Stephen Bauer. Thank you. Now you know why I needed that selfie last night.
You're the first to blame Steve Bauer. It's wonderful to have you here, giving us so much to think about. I hope we have time for a few questions.
I certainly do, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you to moderate.
Oh, absolutely no problem. But Stephen, I'll get you off this here. How's that? I am happy to take questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Steve. I'm a percussionist.
Uh-oh.
Very confused, apparently. So, I love your presentation. I love everything. I just want to do it one small, very important correction. You mentioned about Canada and this different history with slavery.
Yeah.
That's a myth.
Yeah, of course, there's slavery here too, of course. I'm not saying that there was no slavery. There certainly was in Canada, and I do know that. But yes, please go on.
I happened to listen to CBC a couple of days ago, and it has something about the deep, deep connection in Canada and the South. In fact, there was huge organizing in Canada and Montreal and other places for people in the South because they thought it was an affront to white supremacy to be trying to abolish slavery. So there's fundamentally no difference between the US and Canada.
Oh, sure.
Except for Canada pretends that it is.
Of course. Yeah.
Other than that, I love what you have to share.
Thank you.
And I look forward to some of those challenges that you gave to institutions.
Yeah. Thank you. Could I just respond briefly? Absolutely. No, I don't mean to say that Canada is you know, the hands are clean in terms of slavery and white supremacy and anti-blackness. Of course not. No. Canada very much is. There's quite a bit of overlap more overlap between the United States and Canada than there is differences, right? More points of convergence rather than points of divergence. That's true, and that I completely agree with that point. Canada is not burdened with the heavy legacy of chattel slavery that was going on in the southern states of the United States since 1619. That history is different. The cotton that was being grown there and the sugar and the tobacco, I mean, there certainly, I presume that there were plantations, there were certainly slaves. I know that Canada came along a lot later, obviously, too, 1867-ish, is that about right? When,
400 years.
when was Canada founded as a country?
400 years with the French.
Yeah.
Then the English come in mid-1700s.
I don't know why 1867 sticks in my mind, but the Federal, okay, yeah. So at any rate, but thank you. Point taken, absolutely, absolutely. Anyone else with questions? Happy to take any questions, please.
Thank you very much for your talk. You said you needed two things to make anti-racist work.
Yeah.
Tenure and a really good education.
Which was a joke, of course, but yes.
Right, okay, I just wondered, really?
Yeah. No, it was a joke with my little Stephen Colbert delivery there. It's harder to get, because we have crappy internet in New York City, which is probably unsurprising to anybody who's spent time in, well, New York City, let's say. Of course, but yeah, you need tenure, and my plea to tenured colleagues is to, is to use it. It's power, and it's privilege. We really should help people who need support and help. And by golly, if you want to be a defender of the status quo, then you get off the sideline and say, no, we do need to teach Mozart and Schubert, and then it's 10 other composers, and that's that. Then do that, okay? People who approach me who say that usually are doing so in bad faith, I have to be honest. Occasionally they're in good faith, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who approaches me in good faith. I'm now an expert at telling the incoming stuff I get through whatever channel, whether it is in fact good faith or whether it's not. So if you want advice on that account, just reach out and I'll give you a few pointers. Other questions? Thank you so much for today. I know, like I said, it's a challenging talk, but if you have any problems with it, please take it up with Stephen. Thank you for being such a good sport about that. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you so much for being here. You've given us so much to think about, and used the time very effectively, may I add, although we didn't quite as much time for discussion as some of us would have liked. Please join us again on October 19th for our next talk of the series, Maria Cisnet, speaking about music and disability in the career of Dave Johnson? I'm so sorry, I should have had that down. But anyway, it'll be a great talk here in this room, October 19th. And please join me again in thanking Phillip Ewell for sharing his ideas with us.
Thank you.